All right, guys, so now we're going to take a look at forms and inputs. Now, it's important to understand that with forms on a website, displaying them is with HTML, and then we can style them with CSS. But when you submit a form and make it do something, like let's say a registration form, that stuff happens on the back end, and that happens with some type of programming language like PHP or Python or JavaScript or something like that. So just understand that HTML and CSS are to display the form, but server-side programming languages, which you'll learn in another course, that's what is used to actually process the form. Okay, even a simple contact form, although there are some services that you can use that will basically you can kind of insert a snippet into your HTML and you can use their service to process your form. And we may talk about that much later on. But for now, let's go ahead and take a look at creating a form and the different inputs. So I'm going to create a file called 07 underscore forms underscore input.html. And let's go ahead and put our boilerplate in here. We'll change the title to forms and input. And let's go down to the body area and create a form. Okay, so we're going to use a form tag. And notice when I use Emmet to create a form tag, it gives us an action. This is where the form is going to be submitted to. Okay, so you would submit it to a file. Sometimes it's going to be a PHP file if that's what you're working with on your server. It might be something like a file called process.php, where it would take all the form inputs, the values, maybe integrate it with a database so you can insert the data into a database, something like that. So in here is where we're going to put our inputs, and I'm going to separate our labels and inputs with divs. Okay, so divs are just basically just that, divisions, if you want to separate your markup in in certain ways. So I'm going to put a label in here. So if I say label tab, it'll give me a for attribute, and this for attribute, you want this to match the ID of the input, and I'll show you why in a second. So let's say this is going to be for the user's name. We'll put the text name in here. Right under it, we're going to put an input. And in VS Code and Emmet, if I hit enter or tab, it's going to give me a type of text by default, which is what we want right now. So if I go ahead and save this, and let's actually run this in live server, you'll see we have a label and we have our input. Now, if I give this an ID of name, which is the same value I did for the for attribute, if I save that and I click on the label, it'll actually highlight the form. Okay, so if you want that functionality, then you want to put the for in the ID. If this doesn't match, you'll see if I click on the label, it doesn't actually highlight the form. It's not something you need to do, but if you want that functionality, then you want to add both of these. And then a lot of times with inputs, you'll have a name attribute, which in this case, the value just happens to be name. But this is what is used on the server side. So if on the server in, like, let's say PHP, you want to grab the value, you would use whatever this is, in this case name. All right, so let's move on to create another input here. So we'll put another div. We'll do a label this time. Let's make this an email. So we'll put an input in here. Now with Emmet, we can do a colon here and then whatever the type of input. So I want this to be an email type. And if we do that, it'll also give us the name ID by default. So we're going to fill this in with email and email. All right, and I'll save that. And notice it looks just like the text field, but it has to actually be an email for it to submit. Okay, so you can actually easily add validation by just using this type email. Okay, it's just client-side validation. If you're working with a server with, like, let's say PHP, you'd want to add validation there as well. So that's an email field. And if you want to put your label on a separate line without CSS, you could put a line break here. Let's go ahead and do that. Just think it just looks a little better like that. And I'm going to show you how to style a form really nice later on. It's actually going to be one of our challenges. So let's go ahead and create another field here. Let's do a div and a label. And this is going to be for message. And message is going to be a text area, which is different from a text input like this. Because it's bigger. It's for more content, usually like a message or, I don't know, a bio or something like that. And a text area has its own tag. which also has an ending tag. And I'm going to get rid of these for a second here and just have the name and ID. So for name, let's say message. ID, we'll say message. And then we don't have to put anything within the text area tags, but if I save that, let's put a line break after the label and save it. And you'll see that it's a little bigger. Now, if we want to make this even bigger without using CSS, we can use the calls and rows attribute. So for calls, let's do 50 and save. So what this is it's 50 columns going this way. All right. If we want to make it bigger vertically, then we can use rows. So we'll say rows equals 5 and save, and now it's 5 rows going down. And you can make it as big or as small as you want. So that's a text area. So these are the main ones. Like this could be a contact form right here, but there are other ones. Let's look at a select list. So again, we'll put a div in here. Okay. And in here, let's put a select tag with a name and ID. Let's call this gender. Actually, we'll call it sex. We'll be politically correct here. So we'll say sex, and actually we want to go inside the select. We don't want to do this. I meant to put a label here. So let's do label. And then inside the select is where we want to put our options. If I just save it like this, I forgot to put the text in here, we have just an empty select list. So for each option, we want to put an actual option tag with a value. So in this case, we'll say male, and then we'll put the text in here. And let's just copy this down. We'll say female. And then we'll just put other as an option as well. Okay, so now we have a select list with kind of this drop down menu where we can select an option. Okay, so that is select. Let's take a look at number. So we'll have a label, and let's make this one an age. You might use this for age. Put a line break here. And let's say input and then colon number, because we want it to be the type of number. And if you don't want to remember these Emmet shortcuts right now, if it's too much, you don't have to. It will make your life easier in the future. So for name, let's say age, and for ID, age. Okay, if we save that, it's going to look like a text field, but when we click inside of it, or when we hover over it, actually, we get these arrows, and we can go ahead and we can kind of just increment and decrease the number. We can also type in a number, and we can't type in any letters except for E, because that can actually be part of a number. So that's a number field. It's good for ages, stuff like that. Let's take a look at the date type. So we'll say div, we'll do a label, and let's make this one birth date. And we'll put a line break at the end here. Okay, we want to do input type of date, and we'll say birth date for the name and birth date for the ID. Save that, and it's going to give us this. Now, there's two ways we can use this. We can click inside of it. We can put in like like that. Or we can click this little arrow, which will give us this date picker, and we can actually pick a date. We can go ahead and scroll through the months and years, and makes it a lot easier to format dates, and it makes the user format it in a certain way. So next, let's look at radio buttons. Create another div here, and let's do label. For this, let's call it membership. Maybe this is some kind of sign-up form for a membership, and there's different levels. So we're going to do an input for each one with the type of radio. We'll call the name is going to be the same for each one, which will be membership, but the value is going to be different for each one. So value, let's say there's a membership called simple. All right, so we'll do, what happened here? Value is going to be simple, and then the ID, we'll say membership. So if we want to have more than one radio button, we'll just copy this down. Let's do 3 times. Let's say the second membership value is going to be standard, and then this third one is going to be, let's say, super. Maybe it's like a hosting package or something like that. So if we save, you'll see that we just have the buttons. There's no label. And if we want a label, we just put the text right next to it. So we'll say simple. Okay, we don't even have to do like a label tag or anything. Standard and super, and save, and there we go. So now we can choose one of these. Okay, now let's say that when you load the page you want one pre-selected. If you want to do that, what you can do is you can take the one you want selected, like let's say standard, and we can add an attribute here of checked. So if I say checked and then it loads the page, you'll see that it's automatically going to be checked. And I forgot to mention with select, we can do the same thing. Let's say we want female selected. On a select list, you don't use checked, you use selected. So if I save that, now notice that female is selected by default. Also, if we want to pre-fill a value here, like let's say in name, we want a value, we can actually add a value attribute. And let's say John Doe, and save. Now sometimes you may want something in here that's not an actual value, but kind of like a message, like enter an email or something like that. Before HTML5 we would have to actually use a value, but you would want that to go away when you click in the box, so we would have to use JavaScript to add that functionality. But with HTML5 came placeholder. Okay, so if we want to add placeholder and set that to, let's say, enter an email, and we save, now it seems like it's filled like the value, but notice the text is lighter, and if I click inside of it, it doesn't like it doesn't go away, but it gives me the cursor at the beginning. It's not something that I actually have to delete, which we don't want. Okay, so that's a placeholder attribute. So the last type I want to show you is a checkbox, which is very similar to a radio button, except you can choose multiple options. Notice with the radio I can only choose one. Okay, so there's different situations where you might want to use a checkbox, and certain situations where you might want to use a radio. So I'm going to copy the whole div with the membership, and let's change this to, let's just say I like. This will be like a hobbies, I guess, or I mean, it doesn't matter. It's just an example. But we want to change all the types here to checkbox. Now I'm going to show you another little trick. If you highlight something, like let's say radio, and you want to choose the next thing that matches the next text of radio, you can hold Control D and it'll choose the next one. If you want to choose the next, do it again, and notice all three are now selected, and I can change them all at the same time. I'm going to change them all to checked. I'm sorry, not checked, checkbox, like that. And then if you hit escape, it'll bring you back to your single cursor, or you can just click somewhere else. And then for the name, I'm going to double click and highlight, and I want to select all the memberships here. So I'm going to do Control D again, just to select all of these, and I'm going to change it to likes, like that. Okay, and then we can escape, and there we go. So we have a checkbox, likes. For the values, I'm going to change this one to, let's say bike. Let's say this is like a vehicle. So bike might not be the best example, but it's fine. I want to change that to bike. This we'll do car. And we want to change the value here to car. Should probably do the values lowercase. The value is the actual data that gets sent to the server. Let's say boat, and we'll change that to boat. Okay, so let's save that. Now we have a checkbox that says I like. Car is selected by default because we have checked. I'm going to get rid of that. And we can go ahead and we can check as many as we want. Like that. Okay, so that is a checkbox. Now we're going to add a submit button, because obviously a form is no good unless you can actually submit it. Now with a submit, you can do a couple things. You can either Oh, and that's something I want to show you too. If we have all of these tabbed over and we want to bring them back, we can hold Shift and then hit Tab and it'll bring it backwards. So for a submit button, we could use an input like this. We could say input and give it a type of submit, and then give it a value, which would be the text that's actually displayed in the button. So if I save that, now we have a button that says submit. Another way to do it would be to use button tag. So we could do button and again give it a type of submit, and now we would just put the text in the middle like that, because input is a self-closing tag, button is not. So you would put the text in the middle. So that will give us the same thing. All right, I'm just going to comment these just so you guys know what is what. So that's a text input, this is an email input, this is a message input, not a message, a text area input. Let's see, this is a select, this is a number, this is a date, radio, and checkbox, and then this is an input submit. Okay, so if you ever need to come back here for reference, you can do that. Let's actually just make this button submit. Okay, now one more thing I want to show you is we can add a reset button. I'm going to actually comment out one of these because we don't want two submit buttons. But if we want to do a reset, we can do button with the type of reset like that. We'll put the text reset in here. And now if I fill some stuff in, let's say 33, and then I hit reset, it'll clear everything out except for John Doe because we hard coded that value in here like that. All right, so that's how we can create forms, and I know that this form is extremely ugly. I'm going to show you how to style forms when we get to the CSS section. This is just how we can actually display the fields. All right, guys, so that's it. I'll see you in the next video.